All right, welcome to Team 33. We have had the pleasure of a former Borussia Dortmund footballer on the show before. That was Jovan Karofsky, who was part of the Champions League winning team in 1997, the first American to win a European Cup medal. Now, Dortmund's story is very interesting. It's actually set up in a book called Building the Yellow Wall, The Incredible Rise and Cult Appeal of Borussia Dortmund. The author is Uli Hesse, one of the great football writers, German football writer, author of Tor, but also I've read many of his ESPN columns. Uli, welcome along to the show. How are you?
Hi, Raf. I'm blushing already.
Yeah, and I've been told by the producer outside that the picture behind you is, there's a bit of a story behind it.
Yeah, I think it's John Motson, right? Let me look just a little bit.
Yeah.
I think you can see the sheepskin.
I can see it there, yeah.
I mean, the pitch doesn't look too British, if you know what I mean.
No, it looks quite snowy though, or if that white colour is supposed to be snow.
Yeah, it is. Maybe, I don't know, maybe it was, although, the boarding, everything is in English, so it must be an English ground.
Yeah, but Uli, just to get on to the book, obviously Borussia Dortmund's one of these fascinating clubs. We saw them have a bit of success under Klopp about 5 years ago, but maybe to take it back to where this club has come from. So, prior to the mid-1950s, obviously, they hadn't achieved a lot on the national stage, but when we actually look back at the history in the 50s, the 60s, 70s and 80s, this is a club that's actually not been a stranger to financial struggles.
Oh, yeah, that's one of the interesting... I mean, before I did this book, I did a book about Bayern Munich. And yes, they've had a few ups and downs, but that was mainly a book about a club that was going from strength to strength. And it's very different with Dortmund. And that's actually part of the club's fabric, if you know what I mean. It's not only the financial struggles, but the problems that the club has had, inform a lot of what the club do today and how they interact with their fans and what they do.
Yeah. Now, the club kind of became the second German club to win the European Cup, obviously, by beating Juventus. And we all remember Lars Ricken, the hometown hero, scoring towards the end, Karl-Heinz Riedle as well. But how and why did that team develop into the national and international force that they were? Because they wouldn't have seemed like an obvious choice to reach that pinnacle in the way that Bayern Munich have.
Well, no, they didn't. You mentioned the ups and downs. And in the book, I talk a lot about, it's not just about the football, The book is also a lot about the club's fans and where the club is coming from. I mean, the region, the rural area, which used to be the industrial heartland of the country. And that went through great economic problems, pretty much like, probably the northeastern England. Yeah. When the steel mill closes and the coal mines close down. And so that was one reason for let's say, the first decline the club had, because it was really successful in the 50s and 60s. I think in the book I mentioned that English language, people who speak English tend to call Borussia Dortmund Dortmund, and tend to call Borussia Mönchengladbach Borussia. I think that's mainly because Gladbach was a big, glamorous team in the 1970s, actually more successful than Bayern Munich domestically. But I tell the story of how when Gladbach had a famous European Cup game against Inter Milan, where they won 7-1, but the game was annulled because the can was thrown from the stands. So during the UEFA inquest, the Gladbach representatives became really annoyed because the UEFA people would constantly refer to their club as Borussia Dortmund. That's because at that point in the early 70s, Borussia Dortmund was still a well-known, famous club, right? They won the Cup Winners' Cup in 1966.
Yeah, and you mentioned the fans, of course, as well, and obviously the fact that it's an industrial region, the Ruhr kind of valley area and the Rhine Valley region. I suppose that kind of colours the relationship that's there between the fans and the club.
Yes, that's one reason, certainly. It's also having to do with, you mentioned the financial problems which the club have had. And, the last one, the really great one, roughly a dozen years ago, when the club was really in danger of actually going out of business. That was a major turning point ever since, the relationship between the club and the fans is really, really close. Has intensified even more because everybody realized that how easily you can lose a club.
Yeah.
And in contrast to some other cities in Germany, say Hamburg or Munich or Cologne, the football club is basically the only thing of any interest in the city, to be honest. So
yeah. For an international audience, certainly. I mean, if you talk about Dortmund, the first thing you think about is the yellow and black jersey, and the BVB Borussia Dortmund. But it was interesting, given the fact that they were also the first German club then to, float on the stock market around the late 90s and around 2000. And, when you're thinking about, the importance of fan bases, you don't really think about it in that financial sense. You kind of think about something that's a bit more, I suppose, homespun. I presume that had a big effect on what happened about 5 years later when the club almost became extinct.
Yes, I mean, not to put too fine a point on it, the reason they went public was they desperately needed money. At that time, most people still felt they were doing fine, everything was okay, and maybe they were, trying to generate those funds to invest in the team even more. Because at that time, there was a bit of megalomania about Dortmund, and they tried to win a rat race against Bayern Munich. But in fact, financial problems were already there when they went public, and they needed the money, to fill a few holes.
And it was also a question of to be able to succeed financially, they had to be successful on the pitch, and that had to be in parallel. And obviously, the period they did win a league title in 2002, but in overall sense, they never really matched what they did in the 90s, which proved to be the big problem.
Yes, absolutely. They'd gotten into a vicious circle, a spiral, where the club was making a lot of money, but then they had to put a lot of money into the team just to make sure money would still be coming in. And at one point that just stopped, and then when they failed to qualify for the Champions League and then were knocked out of the UEFA Cup, that was when it really started to go downhill.
Yeah, and obviously the chairman, Hans-Joachim Watzke, I hope I pronounced that almost close enough to how it should be, but he's the man credited with rescuing the club financially, or at least he's one of the key figures. So what did he do exactly to basically rescue a situation that was very perilous in 2005?
Yes, of course he didn't do it alone. He was just... There are those who say, one side story to all this is that, when the first reports came public about financial problems, the fans did what fans do, which is they went into denial. And so it was basically down to two newspapermen who uncovered the story. And to this day, there are rumors that one of their key informers at the club was Hans-Joachim Watzke, who was at that time mainly working for the parent club, so he couldn't really do anything about, the PLC.
Yeah.
So what he did do, the main thing that he really did do was he assembled a really good team of experts in a very, very short time and try to save the club. And he had to sell it, of course. I mean, he had to sell the rescue plan. That was also one of his major coups, because there were all these creditors. And if any one of them had rejected, the recovery plan, and if any one of them had said, no, I want my money now, then the club would have been bankrupt with immediate effect. Yeah,
and in part of that story as well, Bayern Munich's name comes in, and it's not the first time they've helped a club, because of course 1860 Munich, or what we call 1860 Munich here, who are now in the third tier, they've had some help from Bayern. Bayern basically gave a 2 million loan interest-free, and I wondered how has that coloured the relationship between the clubs, because it's an act of generosity on the face of it, but at the same time, I'm sure, given that there's rivalries there, nobody wants to be the poor relation.
Yeah, it never amazes me that this fascinates people in the UK. This is one of the things they always come up. I think maybe the fascination comes from the fact that in the UK, most clubs are, companies that are owned by individuals or other companies. Whereas in Germany, even though Dortmund have floated shares, the clubs are not technically owned by a company. They are still, clubs, public clubs. So it's not as if, Bayern Munich would be, you cannot compare Bayern Munich to a company that is maybe trying to destroy a competitor. So I think Bayern Munich are quite aware of the fact that, in a way, we're all in this together, So that wasn't the first time they helped the rival club, They even bailed out of quite a few clubs over the years. And it was not as if that 2 million loan was really, really important, Dortmund was so deep in red, It was just a short-term measure. But of course, it was highly symbolic, of course, It was highly symbolic, of course, that the people who had tried to, to topple Bayern Munich off their throne now had to come hat in hands, to Uli Hesse basically and say, listen, mate, we have a problem.
Yeah. And of course, Dortmund then under Klopp did go on to topple Bayern off the throne that they have usually sat on for most of their time in the German league. But interestingly, like the overall, and I'm sure you've written about it before, but like German football's restructuring, which actually led then to the 2014 World Cup. That benefited German football as a whole. Obviously, at youth level, Dortmund have also produced a lot of players that have gone on to play in the first team, like your Marco Reus's and Mario Götze. So we can kind of say, at least at club level, what happened overall in the structural change across the country had a benefit for clubs like them.
Yes, it was even one funny aspect of this whole story is that when we started to rebuild the youth structure, or the nurturing element in this country, one reason we could do it in Germany was that the German FA has some power over the clubs. So the German FA can tell the clubs to do certain things. Yeah. And if not, we'll revoke their license. So one of the things they did was they demanded from the clubs to build proper youth academies, right? But this was during the time when Dortmund, were A, having financial problems, and B, were playing the superstar game. They weren't really interested in bringing in youngsters through. So Dortmund just refused to do that. They waited until the last moment to finally build that academy. And the irony of it all is not only that, once the bubble had burst and the club was just barely saved, they had to rely on cheap homegrown players. It was also there, of course, the kids then produced. And
obviously, of course, Jurgen Klopp being a key figure. We're seeing what he's doing with Liverpool at the moment, where he's guided them to the top of the table temporarily. Of course, we're only going to 3 games into the season, but what was always striking from far away was the relationship between himself and the fans. And there was this phrase I used to hear, "Echt Liebe," at the height of that, Dortmund rise when they won 2 league titles in a row. So, in terms of his force of personality, did he kind of make a point of trying to build that relationship between fans and the team? Did he consciously try and do that, or is that just his force of personality?
I guess he is just like that.
Yeah.
One thing one should not forget about the club's recent history is that Klopp was not brought in to win trophies. That was never the point. He had never won anything before. So and it was not as if Dortmund thought, hey, in 3 or 4 times, a year's time, we will have rebuild and we'll challenge Bayern Munich again. That was not really the plan. It was just he came in at a time when the club was financially safe, but had lost a bit of its identity.
Yeah.
The football was very stale. The coaches were playing terrible football. The fans just didn't really identify with the team anymore. So the people who run the club then said, they played against Mainz a few times, and they felt that Klopp had been able to create this buzz and generate this team spirit and just make a lowly club playing exciting football. And they thought, if he can do the same at our club, that's enough. That's what we want from him. Yeah. He certainly delivered that, but on top of that, also.
And one of the things he did, of course, there was the high tempo gegenpressing, as it was one of the kind of German phrases, or at least new German phrases we kind of learned ourselves. But aside from that style, one of the things, because we were kind of living in that Barcelona era as well, where other people were identifying with this possession-based football, there was a kind of excitement at this kind of high tempo, very vertical football. And I wonder, did Dortmund kind of then start to realise they need to kind of market themselves around this style and this identity?
Well, what do you mean by market themselves?
I suppose this idea, this kind of in a way, Klopp's personality as well as the kind of the very high tempo style of play, and that this is something they can build around, maybe in the way that Barcelona have kind of built around the post-Cruyff era?
Yeah, of course. I mean, they were very lucky when they got Klopp, because they got somebody who did all which I've described a few seconds ago. But on top of that, they also got the perfect marketing tool, if you want to use that term, because it was indeed, yes, a godsend. I mean, I was just in Liverpool over the weekend, and I thought it would be slightly different because Klopp was, language is so important to him, and he has this incredible knack of never saying the same thing twice. He may repeat an idea, but he always finds a fresh way of phrasing it. And I thought it would be different. It must be different in Liverpool, because it's not his language. But I sat during the press conference, and it was exactly like it was in Germany. He opened his mouth, and a joke came out, and then he cracked a few one-liners and had everybody up in stitches, and they loved him. And he's got this. I don't know how he does this. He's really incredible in that regard.
Yeah, and I wonder, has it kind of put pressure? I wonder, has it kind of put pressure on the people who have followed him since? Because there have been a couple of managers, and of course there's a new manager now. But to kind of live up to that legacy.
Yes, it's also I mean, as I say this towards the end of the book, that I wrote the book during what is probably the most difficult year in the entire history of the club.
Yeah.
I had a few chats with fans in Liverpool, so I know that this is, although it made headlines, it's still not really widely known that, that the end of Thomas Tuchel's reign began with a bombing, with an assault on the team.
Yeah.
Which is, nothing like this has ever happened before. It was, imagine somebody was trying to destroy an entire football team just to influence the share price. This is so monstrous that you can't even begin to understand what this must have done to the players. And ever since, it was just, it may not have been the true starting point. The rifts probably go back a bit, but starting with this attack was very, very strange, and lots of strange things happened. The club is still trying to recover from that very, very turbulent year, which, saw 3 coaches from 3 different countries coach the team. And that's more what's weighing on the club, still weighing on the club at the moment, more than, Klopp's legacy in the first place.
Yeah, and I suppose a final question before I let you go. Obviously, they have a new manager in Lucien Favre. They beat RB Leipzig at the weekend 4-1. I saw some of the highlights, and one of the takeaways was probably it didn't seem like a 4-1 in terms of the result. But in terms of style, what are we looking at? Is this an evolution, or is he kind of trying to go back to traditions that were slightly set in stone by Klopp, and then maybe trying to add elements to it?
It's not Thomas Tuchel's possession football. Thomas Tuchel was very much from the Pep Guardiola school of coaching and interacting with people. But it's also not quite Klopp's, gung-ho, high-speed, full-tempo football. So it's somewhere in between. And then you mentioned the game that was very... I think it didn't escape anyone, because even the commentator mentioned that very early on, was that in Klopp's last year in Dortmund began with the fastest goal in Bundesliga history, which Dortmund conceded after 9 seconds.
Yeah.
Very first game. And somehow from that point on, everything that could go wrong did go wrong. And on Sunday, they conceded a goal after 31 seconds. Against a team that is very good, on the counter-attack, like RB Leipzig. So it was the worst possible start to the season. But they recovered and they turned it around. So I think everybody feels that it was a good sign, and everybody's very optimistic now. Yeah,
and actually, just one very, very final point, actually, just as we mentioned RB Leipzig and what they represent in German football, and the fact they're not liked because of the... Obviously, there's a rule in regards to the 50+1, and that fan ownership is such a tradition in Germany. And Dortmund are kind of like the antithesis of this. The yellow wall, that's part of the title of your book. It's a representation of what fan culture means in Germany. Of course, the relationship between the two fan bases would not be particularly strong. But in regards to how fan ownership evolves in the years to come in Germany, do you expect a change? Do you think the fact that the likes of Leipzig have come along might engender something a little bit different, or maybe a breakdown of some of the rules?
Yes, it probably does. It's a big topic at the moment. It's not so much. Well, there's two aspects to it. One of it is that some club representatives think that the rule has already been eroded so much, that it's sort of unfair to keep it, because clubs like Wolfsburg and Leverkusen are exempt from the rule. RB Leipzig have found a cunning way around the rule, and Hanover might be the next club, to get around the rule. So that's one aspect, and the other aspect is, of course, the international competitiveness. There's some people who think that Germany, needs an influx of fresh money, and they hope it will come from investors, which I doubt. But so. There's some signs that the rule is certainly under fire.
Yeah. Well, Uli Hesse, thanks a million for taking the time to chat to me with that wonderful backdrop behind you of John Motson. So the book is Building the Yellow Wall, The Incredible Rise and Cult Appeal of Borussia Dortmund. Thanks a million for taking the time.
Thanks very much.